We mute ourselves.
Sure, you can mute yourselves for right now. That would be great. So good morning. It's nice to see everybody. I am very thrilled to be able to share this platform with two wonderful rabbis, colleagues, and friends. Rabbi Lisa Hochberg Miller, who is the rabbi in Ventura, and Rabbi Laura Geller, who is our speaker this morning. And we've all known each other for quite a number of years. So we're going to be somewhat informal and call each other by our first names. Rabbi Geller is really a trailblazer. She was named as one of Newsweek's 50 most influential rabbis in America. And she was the third woman to be ordained by Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. That was in 1976. She began her career as the Hillel director of the University of Southern California and continued as Pacific Regional Director of the American Jewish Congress. In 1992, she was named Senior Rabbi of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills, the first woman to be called as Senior Rabbi of a major synagogue through a national search. Yay, that is quite an achievement. And thanks to rabbis like Laura, now there are a number of senior rabbis that are women at large congregations, but that was very rare for a long time. Laura also served on the editorial board of the Torah, a Women's Commentary, and was featured in the PBS documentary, Jewish Americans. She's the author of The Torah of My Life, 40 Years in the Rabbinate and Still Counting, fellow of the Corporation of Brown University, from which she graduated in '71. She serves on the board of the Jewish Women's Archive and Encore.org, and as a mentor through Clergy Leadership Incubator. She was named in 2017 by Next Avenue as one of the top 50 influencers in aging. So she and her late husband, Richie Siegel, co-founded High Village, LA, which is the first synagogue-based virtual village, which allows people to age in place, which is really wonderful. And together they wrote this book, Getting Good at Getting Older. Well, as Rabbi Hochberg Miller mentioned a minute ago, it's in a very specific format to look like something that you may remember as younger people, and that is the Jewish catalog. Because Richie Siegel was one of the authors of the original Jewish catalog. And I just want to say something about the Jewish catalog. Here's a little clip from a review. For anyone who has ever wondered how to make wine, crochet a kippah, locate a Jewish film, start a Jewish library, or bring the Messiah, this exciting collection of far-ranging topics can help any Jew, those steeped in tradition or those just discovering Judaism, to become personally involved in the many aspects of Jewish ritual life, customs, cooking, crafts, and creation. So this is the Jewish catalog for Aging with Grace. And I would like to now turn the floor over to Rabbi Laura Geller.
So first of all, it's wonderful to be with my friends and colleagues. Suzanne and Lisa, we have been friends for a really long time. One of the challenges of being in the first generation of women rabbis is that there were no mentors. And so women rabbis have mentored each other across generations. So I can say about both Lisa and Suzanne that they have been mentors and teachers and colleagues and friends. I also would like to particularly say hello to my Machtenister, Nancy Cole. We share the most precious, adorable grandchildren who live in Portland. And so we commiserate often on the telephone about how hard it is to get to Portland to visit our grandchildren. So Nancy, thanks for being here. So we're going to begin. We were going to go into breakout rooms, but we're not. So we're going to have a conversation that might have been better in a more intimate setting and a larger setting by taking a look as we begin at a pretty famous text and asking some questions about it. So one of you will share your screen. So
yes,
we can look at the text.
It will be me.
So can I have somebody read the English?
All right, I'll read it if no one else is going to volunteer.
Okay.
He, Judah ben Tema, used to say, at 5 years of age, the study of scripture. At 10, the study of Mishnah. At 13, subject to the commandments. At 15, the study of Talmud. At 18, the bridal canopy. At 20, for pursuit of livelihood. At 30, the peak of strength. At 40, wisdom. At 50, able to give counsel. At 60, for zikna, which is old, I guess, beard. At 70, for sevia, which is old age, the fullness of age. At 80, the age of strength. At 90, a bent body. At 100, as good as dead and gone completely out of the world.
Okay. Now I want to really have a conversation, so people need to be brave and either raise their hand or put in the chat your responses to this. What surprises you in this second century vision of a life? This is from Pirkei Avot, which is a little tractate of the Mishnah around the second century. What surprises you?
I think at 80, the age of strength.
Okay, what is surprising about that?
I wouldn't have thought at that time that too many people would be alive at 80, let alone strong.
So that's an really interesting comment. Why do you think they might have argued that? Remember that life expectancy was really young. So
Yeah.
if you made it to 80, what would that have said about you?
You must be strong.
You must be strong, right? So that's already an important sort of distinction between lives then and lives now. What else is a surprise?
Having just been bent over with a bad lower back, I didn't need to wait to be 90.
Right, this assumes a kind of health throughout a person's life. What else?
It's interesting that wisdom comes at 40 and not at 90 or 100. In other words, you think that the older you are, the more wise.
So that's, I think, an interesting thing. First of all, what does the word zikna mean? It comes from the same word as beard, so it has something to do with growing older. But there is a rabbinic commentary that understands that as sort of an acronym, one who has acquired wisdom. So at 40 for wisdom, at 50 able to give counsel, at 60 for one who has acquired wisdom. So there's something different about the wisdom at 40 than at 60. And then 70, the word is seva, which actually means, white hair or old age, but also is used in the Psalm verse. If you see at the top of the screen, it's on the Shabbat morning Psalm. The righteous will blossom like a date palm. They will still be fruitful in seva. In the fullness of age, they will be full of sap and still juicy. So this notion of 70 has to do with still being fruitful, full of sap, and juicy.
I love that.
So what else is a surprise? If you think about
I find it a little shocking that that you would be married before you would have the means to support yourself.
Okay, what does that tell us about kinship structure in the early stages of our tradition?
Priority of marriage, and probably also a real being in tune with physical development and human desire.
Well, and also that your parents are going to support you.
I think that's true. Your parents are going to support you, right? Who is the subject of this, or the object? Who are they talking about?
They're talking about Jewish males.
They're talking about boys and men, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Already we notice, not a surprise given our tradition, that this is not written from a perspective that it incorporates women's experience necessarily. But if you were to imagine this description in stages, at 18, the bridal canopy, at 20, for pursuit of livelihood, at 30, the peak of strength, as category number 1, stage number 1. I'm sorry, stage number 1, 5 years, the study of scripture, 10, Mishnah, 13, subject to the commandments. That's where we get the notion of bar mitzvah. And at 15, the study of Talmud. What is the work of that stage, this first stage?
The brain.
And study and brain.
Study and learning. Okay, so the first stage of life is about learning. The second stage at 18, the bridal canopy, 20 for pursuit of livelihood, 30 for the peak of strength. What's that about?
Procreation.
Building your family unit.
What we call midlife, right? Building your family, marriage, children, career, right? At 40, wisdom, 50, give counsel, 60, one who has acquired wisdom, 70, fullness of age, 80, the age of strength. What is the third stage about?
Acquiring wisdom beyond just the basic knowledge that you've had all along.
Acquiring wisdom, right? So the first stage is about learning, the second stage about building careers, the third stage about wisdom, acquiring it and being able to
Give back.
give it back. And then at 90, a bent body, at 100, as good as dead. What is that about?
Old
Useless,
age.
uselessness.
Okay, it's
Getting ready for death.
getting ready
Yeah.
for death. Uselessness is an interesting, I mean, we'll maybe actually visit that again, but certainly the extreme old age, okay? So my question for you is, if you were writing this now, what would the stages be? Would they be the same? Obviously, the age specific would be different. Nobody we know gets married at 18. But do we also experience the first third of our age as about learning, the second about building careers, the third about acquiring and giving back wisdom, and the end about getting ready to die? Is that how you experience your own life stage?
Absolutely not. Learning goes on forever.
Okay, that's a really important point. Learning goes on forever. Now I want to ask a question about learning goes on forever. When did you go to college, some of you?
What decades or what age?
Which of these thirds did you go to college?
Oh. The
Two.
Second.
Age
the
2.
second.
Or the first or the second, right? But when whoever, again, I can't see you, so this is a little hard to do, but whoever said learning goes on, our whole lifetime. If that's really true, why is it that we only go to college when we're young and we don't go to college now when I actually have more time and could take college more seriously? I mean, so if we were reimagining our lives and we really do believe that learning continues throughout our lives, what kinds of changes will we make in the way we construct institutions and universities, which, by the way, are looking for finding ways to get new students because it's hard to get people to pay tuition? What would it be like if my alma mater, Brown University, also had a very serious program for active older adults? UCLA has a program like that, right? I'm not sure where other universities, but to think about learning in a different way would be sort of interesting. What else, how else would you describe our lives differently from these stages?
I think giving back starts younger and continues until old age or until death.
So that's, I think, really interesting. And by the way, all of the studies show that people who actually do give back, specifically older people like us who give back to younger people, not only do the younger people thrive in very measurable ways, but the active older adults also thrive in ways that are actually medically measurable in terms of heart disease and all kinds of different things. So giving back throughout our life is actually part of the prescription for getting good at getting older.
Maybe connected to that idea, Laura, I just noticed that in looking at this text, that third stage is a much longer stretch of time. The first stage is, 15 years. The second stage is, from 20 to 40. But the stage of wisdom and giving counsel and of insight is, here 40 years. It's a much longer, it's a much longer stage. And that, I think that also tells us a lot about our people and the Jewish mindset. When you talk about giving, that idea that we are in that place of having acquired wisdom and that the goal in our life is to share that wisdom.
So I think that that's really important. What is the purpose of a life actually emerges when we take a look at these stages of a life. So I stop sharing the screen. And I want to ask you, what do you call this stage of your life? Now, I can't see everybody, but I would guess, Suzanne and Lisa, help me out here, that the majority of people on this call are probably between, let's say, 60 and 90. Is that a good assessment?
Yeah. And by the way, on the upper right-hand corner under view, if you go to gallery view, you can see everybody.
I know, but then I can't see my notes that are also.
Okay.
So,
all right. Well, I'll call on people if you want.
Okay. What do you call this stage that you're in? Let me pose it more specifically. How many of you like the word senior? I'd like to be called senior. Raise your hand.
I prefer old.
Okay. Somebody who likes senior. Is there anybody who has her or his hand up for senior?
Oh, only for discounts.
Okay. Right. We do, in the olden days when there were still movie theaters, right? I would take those senior discounts, right? Anybody love the name senior?
I think, Rabbi Geller, I think forget seniors. The age of wisdom is lovely because it covers the waterfront.
Okay.
I think the thesis that you just explained, although it was written a few years ago, is needs a massive rewrite. It absolutely does. And something you said a moment ago, they used to say that education is wasted on the young. Remember that? Well, in a way, strangely enough, it was, because I think as we age, I think we become more mature, and I am enjoying, except for one or two major things, enjoying my life into my octogenarian years. So it's a bit outdated, but I like some of the things that you are pointing out and everybody else is, and I'll shut up and listen.
So the question is, though, what do you call the stage? So senior, I don't know about your synagogues, but, often a group that might be directed towards folks of this age cohort would be called the senior group.
Maturity.
But what's a word that you would use? Like if you were naming a group.
I like what my husband calls us. He calls us mature adults.
Okay, mature adults is one way to name us. Good. What are some other names?
Except I've met an awful lot of people at this stage who are far from mature.
Okay, it's interesting that, there seems to be some connection between growing older and acquiring wisdom, but it doesn't happen all the time. Maybe you need to be a little bit older in order to really be somebody who has acquired wisdom, but that doesn't mean that just getting older makes you wise. So I think that that's true. There are a lot of people in our age cohort who wouldn't be particularly mature. What other words do you use?
I call us grown-ups.
Okay, grown-ups. Any pushback against grown-ups? Why would somebody not want to choose that word? Nancy and my son and her daughter who are married to each other, they're grown-ups too. And they're quite grown up and dealing with stuff that we didn't have to deal with as they try to homeschool their, little ones while they're both still working full-time from home. So I don't own the word grown-up. It isn't just about me. They are quite grown-ups as well.
I think grown-ups is like too close to the younger group. Like you're little and then you're a grown-up, you know?
All right.
And we're well beyond that.
Somebody put in the chat of a certain vintage.
Okay. But again, that isn't exactly a name. That's a description, but it isn't exactly a name.
My husband said that we should be called liberated children.
Okay. That is, actually, it's interesting because as people began to move into adult-only communities, right, like Leisure World, they were pitched as second childhoods. And the question is that really what we want? I actually don't want a second childhood. I already had a childhood and I want something different at this stage of my life. So what about boomer?
Oh, I'm not.
What about boomers? Okay, the problem with boomer
I think boomer is the negative term.
in what sense is it a negative term?
It seems like people use boomer as to degrade other people sometimes. They'll say, well, you're a boomer, so that's why you don't understand how to use your computer, for example, or something like that.
We are going to talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about some of the tensions that exist between generations, right? Okay, boomer was a meme that came out, and it basically meant, okay, boomer, you screwed up the world that you're leaving to us, so, you know, stay out of it. So yes, boomer is a problematic word. It's also a technical term. A boomer is someone who was born between 1946 and 1964, and not all of us on this call are technically boomers. Some of us are older, some of us might be younger. So there are generations that are defined by specific years, and the boomer is one of those. So other words that have been used.
Laura, I think about the word elders, and I think about, I sort of have this sense that when we talk about like Native Americans and we speak about their elders, we think of that with great reverence, and we understand it within the context of their culture, who the elders are, and that the elders are the ones who hold wisdom and insight and are respected for what they bring. And Judaism has that same tradition of elders, but I don't think that we want to embrace that word, or maybe, maybe we've had this shying away from aging so much so that elders has not been a word that has naturally worked or gravitated in our culture.
So I think that's really an important point. The problem with the word elder is that it seems too close to elderly.
Elderly, right.
Elderly is that last stage at 90, at 100, right? Elder, but as Lisa points out, in most religious tradition, elders were venerated. And to be called an elder, to acquire that status would have been something that you would aspire toward. So one of the challenges for us as we explore the question of getting good at getting older is, how do we take back a notion like that? And what does Judaism have to teach us about that? So other kinds of words that are used. Retired, it only works if you worked. Not everybody works.
I like more experienced.
Okay, experienced, seasoned, active older adults, rewired.
I've known some women that use the word crone for older women.
Okay, that's really an interesting possibility. The naming of something that was viewed as critical, that is now viewed as positive. And so you have, particularly in the women's movement, the possibility of calling yourself a crone. But again, if this is a inclusive age cohort, it doesn't separate necessarily women and men. And so crone would only work for women. The word that I like best was coined by Laura Carstensen, who is the head of the Stanford Center on Longevity. She calls us perennials. Still blooming, right? Some years not so good, some years better, but still blooming. There's a kind of life in that I think is important for us to think about. But the point of this is, if you can't name it, how do you even think about it? This, by the way, is something that we learned in the women's movement. You know, if you couldn't name women's experience as Jewish experience, It wasn't Jewish experience. So we need to begin to think about how we think about ourselves, both individually, but also as a cohort. And I think it's really important to point out that we're not just talking about us on this call. We're talking about creating a new life stage, because someday Nancy and my millennial children will be between 60 and 90, right? And how we navigate this stage, how we create this stage, this new stage, is important for those that come after us. It's also important to point out that it's not really a chronological age, it's a life stage. But in this life stage, we're different from each other. Some of us are healthy and still active. Others of us wrestle with physical challenges, with disabilities, illness, caregiving. Some of us are parents of adult children, grandparents, some of us. Some of us don't have kids or grandchildren. And some of us don't have the kinds of connections with our children or grandchildren that we wish we had. So you can't lump us all together. Some of us are solo agers. Some of us have partners. Some of us have discretionary resources, and some of us worry about financial future. It's important to notice that we have a whole lot in common, and we want to think of ourselves as a cohort, but that we're still a diverse group. And as we reach out to each other, we recognize that we're both similar and different. What we're doing is reimagining a life stage, and at the same time, we're reimagining a lifespan. Demographers predict that children who are born since 2000 will live to be 100. So even that last stage of the 90 and 100 from the Pirkei Avot text is going to be different, right? Not every 90-year-old in the future is going to have a bent body, and not every 100-year-old is as good as dead in this changing reality. Children born since 2000 will live to be 100. Children born in 2070 will live to be 104. But most of the policies in the world in which we live were put in place for very different assumptions about the age of our populations. Life expectancy 5,000 years ago was 18. In the 1900s, life expectancy reached 47. It reached 77 at the end of the last century. Today, our life expectancy is 79, and it continues to increase. These are rough numbers, but you get the idea that things are changing. So Laura Carstensen, the woman that I mentioned before, the head of the Stanford Center on Longevity, she has written, "It's time to get serious about a major redesign of life." In her view, the tension surrounding aging, which many of us feel, is due largely to the speed with which life expectancy increased. Long lives are not the problem. The problem is that we're living in cultures that were designed for lives half as long as the ones that we're living. So just think about it. Retirements that span 4 decades are unattainable for most individuals and governments, right? Education that ends in the early 20s isn't suited for longer working lives. And social norms that dictate intergenerational responsibilities between parents and young children don't address the reality that some families include 4 or 5 living generations. This is probably the first time in the history of the world when that's true. A few years ago, this Stanford Center on Longevity launched an initiative called the New Map of Life that is bringing together experts, including engineers, climate scientists, pediatricians, geriatricians, behavioral scientists, financial experts, biologists, educators, healthcare providers, human resource consultants, and philanthropists to envision what vibrant century-long lives would look like, and then to begin to remap it. So our question as a society ought to be, how do traditional models of education, of work, of lifestyles, of social relationships, financial planning, healthcare, early childhood, and intergenerational compacts need to change to support long lives? So these are really challenging questions in our world, but they're also challenging for our Jewish community. And the bottom line of my presentation is to say to all of you, we are the pioneers at getting good at getting older. And how we do this is really going to matter for ourselves, for our Jewish community, and also for the world. So that is the introduction that leads to this book.
Lisa, were you going to ask a couple questions?
I'd love to. Thank you for so much extraordinary information, Justin, here, and getting us to think about us, ourselves as part of this cohort. I personally love the word perennials, and I have to tell you that as I was reading your book and I hit that word, I circled it like 3 times, Laura, because I love that description. That description, it felt so real for right now, that there are moments that you are in strength, there are moments that you are not blooming, there are moments that you are blooming again. In this sense of expecting ourselves to be at 100% every day, year after year, is not this stage of life. It may have been another stage of life. So it gave permission, I thought, to really be real at this moment of who we are and what's going on in our life. So with that, I want to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book?
So thanks for the question. About 50 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, there was a revolution taking place in the Jewish world. I wasn't active in creating that revolution, but I suspect it was part of the reason I ended up going to rabbinical school in 1971. The revolution was energized by the beginning of the Jewish counterculture, and it was captured a few years later by the book that Suzanne held up at the beginning, a book that was modeled after the Whole Earth Catalog, which was called The Jewish Catalog, a do-it-yourself kit.
Did you email it?
This book empowered a generation of baby boomers, we were baby boomers, as the introduction to the Jewish Catalog said, to take back Judaism from the staid hands of our elders and reshape it for our own times. And the book, as Suzanne pointed out, offered the tools to take responsibility for our own Jewish lives. Some of you may even have used that book, the recipe in that book, the first time you ever made challah. Well, as Suzanne said, the author of that book the co-author was my late husband, Richard Siegel. I didn't know him then. We got married years later. But that was the 60s and 70s. And now some of us are in our 60s and 70s. And Rich felt that we, that same generation, needed another do-it-yourself kit to help us navigate the changes that are part of growing older. So that's the first origin story of the book, the idea that we needed a Jewish catalog for our age cohort. And getting good at getting older does give us the same kind of toolkit that the Jewish catalog did. And like the Jewish catalog, it does it with a sense of humor. The book includes irreverent cartoons and some photographs, including my favorite, which is the backside of Maxine Menster's tombstone in Iowa, which is a recipe for cookies. Apparently, every time someone asked for her cookie recipe, she would say, "Over my dead body." So let me tell you the second reason why Rich and I wrote the book. I was 62. Richie and I were beginning to think about our retirement. And I noticed that a huge percentage of my congregants at Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills were boomers, and many were leaving the congregation. That observation led to a listening campaign where we talked to 250 congregants in house meetings in people's homes, facilitated by congregants who had gone through a sort of quick training process. And we asked people in these pretty intimate conversations, how do you feel about this stage of life? This stage between building our families and our careers and frail old age. Understanding that we're all living 30 years longer than our grandparents did, and those 30 years are not tagged on to the end of our life, but in this new stage, again, that did not exist for our grandparents. We asked people, what do you want in those extra years? Now that more years have been added to our life, how do we add more life to our years? And we asked people, what keeps you up at night? What gets you up in the morning? What are your fears? What are your hopes? So back to the listening campaign, people shared their fears. There were 4 primary fears. The first fear was becoming invisible. Who am I when I'm no longer the senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel Beverly Hills? The second fear was being isolated. Who are my friends now? People who used to be my friends, they moved away. Some of them have died. My work colleagues, they're not in my life in the same way. I'm afraid of being alone. A third fear was being without purpose. What am I going to do all day? And the fourth fear was being dependent. God forbid I should ever be dependent, especially on my children. So those were the fears that emerged in the listening campaign. And in the process of this listening, people shared lots of questions. Questions like, how do I navigate changing relationships with older parents? Some of us still have older parents. With millennial children, with intimate partners, and in particular with friends. How do I nurture long-term connections? How do I let go of toxic friendships? Now that I know that there's less time ahead than there was behind, do I still want to be connected to people who suck energy from me as opposed to give energy and nurture? And then the question, how do I make new friends? Some of you know that it was Betty Friedan's birthday on Thursday. She would have been 100 years old. And there was a very wonderful webinar organized by the Veteran Feminists of America honoring her life. She was not only a groundbreaking thinker, obviously, in terms of feminism, but it turns out that she was one of the first people to begin to think about this stage of life. And in 1993, she wrote a book called The Fountain of Age. In it, she wrote, more and more, psychologists have found that for older persons, loneliness is not necessarily linked to the death of a spouse or to how infrequently they see their children or grandchildren, but to the absence of personal relationships with peers, friends of their own age or any age, who share their interests and with whom they sustain their roots of shared experience. So the significance of friendship, hugely important in this stage of life. And it came up a lot in this listening campaign. It also made me realize something, Suzanne and Lisa, that I would be curious to hear from you about is, how does Jewish tradition acknowledge the power of friendship when it thinks about mourning rituals? We all know that when someone dies, there are categories of mourning. Parents, children, spouses, and siblings are technically mourners, right? And when rabbis meet with a family to talk about a funeral, those are the people usually that are in the room. Who's not usually in the room are old friends who also are mourners, particularly in a complicated position if the person who died doesn't live in the same community. If I lost my best friend who lives in Ithaca, God forbid, how would I mourn her? I wouldn't be in the story somehow, and people here don't know her, and how would I be supported by a community of people who would recognize my status as a mourner? And how we as people who are connected to synagogues imagine seeing the reality of the power of friendship. So hold on to that question, you guys, and we'll get back to it, okay? So other questions that emerged in this listening campaign. As friends move away, and kids too, as was the case for Nancy and me, with whom do I want to grow old? And in what kind of setting? Do I want to move to a retirement community? Do I want to move to be near my kids? Nancy, which one of us is going to get there first, right? Do I want to stay in my home? If I stay in my home, I'm a widow. What do I need to be able to live a life that I am connected to people who will be there for me when I need them? Do I want to share my house, open it up to a younger person, or literally be like the Golden Girls and have a bunch of people that are my friends living with me in the house? These were the kinds of questions that emerged. And this, by the way, led to us imagining what became Chai Village LA, which is an intentional virtual village between two synagogues, Temple Isaiah and Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills, where people age in place but have worked very hard to create a community that is supportive of them. And I know that other synagogues, some in Los Angeles, some actually in Long Island, are beginning to explore that as a model. So with whom do you want to grow old? And when do you start thinking about that? That becomes really critically important. Another question that came up often is, how do I deal with illness? That of my own or that of my friends? It is true that people are sick at all different stages in their life, but there's no question that there's more illness at this stage of our life. Some people have a rule that is called the organ recital, that when they get together with friends, virtually now, but face-to-face in those days when it was possible, and it will be again, that you could only talk about your organs for 5 minutes, right? Everybody would get 5 minutes to talk about whatever was wrong with whatever different organ, and then after that, they would have to move on to a different conversation. How do you deal with illness? And how do you deal with the illness of your friends? Other questions. What do I need to do to get ready for the inevitable? Those end-of-life conversations that nobody wants to have. How do I have them with my adult kids? It turns out that at Temple Emmanuel, we discovered that the majority of people have end-of-life directives, no surprise, but an incredibly small percentage have ever talked to their adult children about what they want at the end of their life. And I know that Lisa and Suzanne and I have been in way too many hospital rooms where a beloved or not so beloved mom or dad are no longer able to articulate their wishes, and grown-up children are fighting with each other about what mom or dad would have wanted. Leads to unbelievable toxicity, the breakdown of family relationships that could so easily be avoided if we would be able to have those conversations. And then other questions, some of this came up when we talked about this stage, the work of this stage. What will give meaning to my life now that I no longer work full-time? How can I find a volunteer or paid position to which I can really bring my experience, my talent and passion? I have a lot to give still, and I want to find a way to give back in a way that honors my experience, where I can actually really be helpful. Another series of questions. What do I have to do now, I'm 70, to become the 85-year-old that I someday hope to be? We all know that scene from When Harry Met Sally, when Estelle Reiner points and says, I want what she's having, right? So we know people who are 85 or 90, and some of them are, in fact, role models for us. How do I become that 85-year-old or 90-year-old? What do I have to do now to become that person? And how can Jewish wisdom and spiritual practice help me cultivate those characteristics, resilience, gratitude, patience, forgiveness, that can help me become that person? And finally, questions of legacy. What lives on after me? And the important question that kept coming up, and I suspect is real for all of you as well, what do we do when our kids don't want our stuff? And the truth is, our kids don't want our stuff. All of these questions became the table of contents for the book, Getting Good at Getting Older. There are 6 sections of the book. The first is getting good at gaining wisdom. The second, getting good at getting along. The third, getting good at getting better. The fourth, getting good at getting ready. The fifth, getting good at giving back. And the sixth, getting good at giving away. Each section of the book offers actual tools and resources. This is not a sermon. This is actually a toolkit that specifically deals with issues in those categories. And it's not a book that you read from beginning to end. It's a book that you pick up when you're having issues with your millennial kids, or it's time to begin to plan a funeral. You know, we plan for everything in our life. A Temple Emanuel in the olden days, anyway. You wanted to have a bar mitzvah when the kid was in 4th grade. You begin to plan for it, right? We plan for weddings. We plan for everything. The thing we don't plan for is our funerals. Well, we should be planning for that as well. So it's a book that you pick up at these different moments of your life. How do you make new friends? You're moving to a new community. How do you let go of a toxic friendship? All of that stuff is specifically dealt with in the book. That's, I think, why the book is important and apparently is making a difference in people's lives.
Laura, sorry.
Go ahead, Suzanne.
You ask absolutely excellent questions, obviously, that one must ask. I'm wondering also if you could talk a little bit about what are the practices? Because you talk a lot about various kinds of practices at the beginning of the book in terms of staying healthy mentally and physically.
So there are different ways. I mean, the book deals with it in 2 different chunks. One is getting good at getting better, the specific practices of getting better. And this is something that we need to be doing throughout our whole life. It has to do with exercise. It has to do with nutrition. I mean, all of those kinds of things that are very obvious, but also issues of taking care of our emotional selves, taking care of relationships and the kind of work that can be done. I mean, it's a really interesting chapter about how relationships, those of us who are in relationships with significant partners, how to continue to nurture those relationships as we get older. So specific practices that deal with that. I mean, exercises that people do. And then the section on getting good at gaining wisdom is really about the spiritual tools that Judaism has that helps us cultivate, for example, forgiveness or cultivate gratitude. Practices like journaling or meditation or spiritual direction or even pilgrimage, how to think about travel as a way of a spiritual practice. Going back to the old country, wherever that is, or going back to Brooklyn, if that's your old country, how to imagine travel as a way of helping us sort of get good at getting older. So all of those are kind of talked about in these different sections of the book.
Laura, I want to just tell you that I really appreciate that piece. I was listening to your words, and I'm sure for everyone on this call, so much of what you've said has triggered so many thoughts and experiences. And, you know, I've been nodding along because you've touched on so many things that are true for me. And I started to think, you know, what makes this cohort different from other cohorts? I mean, this is a cohort that has come together this morning representing 2 synagogues. And so much of what you're talking about is universal for the perennials, regardless of what faith tradition you come out of. But I really appreciate what you just said and what you address in the book, which is, what is it that Judaism specifically brings to us to strengthen us at this moment? What is it that our tradition brings to us? And you touched upon these characteristics and these qualities of working, the notion always of growing and learning and gaining wisdom, but being able to address the issues of patience and forgiveness and finding peace within, that those are extraordinary pieces that really do speak to, you know, aging Jewishly and moving through this time Jewishly. I was thinking as well that so much of the advice that you've given, you know, it works in the before times and the after times, but here we are in pandemic times, and that challenge of creating friendships again, staying physically active and strong, huge challenges for us as we're sitting, you know, in this environment. I'm wondering if you could address that a little bit. And I'm also curious if you'll share a little bit more, as you talked about the Chai Village being a virtual community. So that feels like that fits into this question too, if you can talk about now.
So the book was published before
Right.
in October a year ago, 2 years ago, before there was.
Right. I remember I bought it from you at the Rabbi's
Right.
High Holiday program 2 years ago. Yeah.
So it was a lifetime ago, before the plague. Actually, before people in our age cohort were afraid that we wouldn't have the opportunity to get good at getting older, right? The world has completely changed. But in some ways, the issues the book deals with are more relevant than ever because, ironically now, because of the pandemic, all the issues that are part of our lives are more urgent. The first is ageism, not just institutional ageism, that it's hard for people in our age cohort to find a job and people, don't see you when you walk into a restaurant in those days when you could walk into a restaurant, or that the only acceptable ism in our society among nice people is ageism, right? You can make jokes about old people. You can sell Hallmark cards that make jokes about old people. No other group of people can you lump together and have negative stereotypes about. So institutional ageism is real, but equally important, I think, is internalized ageism. The negative stereotypes that we have of ourselves. All of us who say 70 is the new 50. We're not really getting older. I mean, it's complete denial. The truth is, we are getting older. And now, because of the pandemic, all of us, even those of us who denied that we were getting older, well, we can't deny it anymore. Because now it's actually a frightening time to be an older adult. We all know that, right? And as somebody mentioned before, in addition, the response to the pandemic has lifted up these ageist stereotypes, like about boomers, okay, boomer. Or even worse, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was actually a trending meme, #boomer_remover. That said, okay, it's not so bad if older people die. Who cares about older people dying? I mean, actually, the Attorney General or whatever of Texas actually said that, and we have seen this conversation around the question of, the value of older people's lives compared to all the other values that are wrestling with in terms of testing and vaccine. I mean, it's a complicated story, but these issues are coming up in ways that existed before, but now are really in everybody's consciousness. So there's tension between generations. But at the same time, this is a new intergenerational moment. The higher vulnerability of those of us over 60 to the virus has confronted our adult children with perhaps their first serious encounter with health challenges that we face or their grandparents face. And until now, our efforts to stay and act young delayed the arrival of concerns about health. We didn't talk about it with our kids. Now people are having those conversations. And we are recognizing that, yeah, we are slowing down. I mean, we can't pretend that we're not. Our children worry about us, the fear, the possibility of carrying the virus to us. And now some of us are beginning to admit that we might need help and that there are important conversations we should be having with adult children. At the same time, many adult children have moved back into their parents' homes, sometimes bringing grandchildren with them. The value and possibility of intergenerational connections have never been more clear. As Jews, we often think about intergenerational connections as lador vador, from us to them, my wisdom to my children, right? But I think what we're learning now is it's not lador vador, it's dor vador, generations with generations. We need each other. The idea, the fear of being dependent, God forbid I should ever be dependent on my children. The truth is, we are always dependent. They're dependent on us. We're dependent on them. There's no such thing as independence or complete dependence. What we're really learning through this pandemic is we need to cultivate interdependence. What does that look like? and how do generations together, both in our own families and outside of our families, in our synagogue, what does that look like? The pandemic has lifted that out for us. A third issue is the increased focus on loneliness, and this is specific to Suzanne's question. It's only made worse. We know this by sheltering at home. But it's important to remember that before COVID, there was another epidemic in our country, the epidemic of loneliness. And it was labeled a public health crisis. Other countries have acknowledged that. In the United Kingdom, there's actually a minister of loneliness, someone whose job it is to think about social policy, to change, to make changes that will find ways to decrease the real issue of loneliness. I mean, it's a position, it's like a cabinet position there. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who some of you remember was the former US Surgeon General, now part of President Biden's team. Before the pandemic, he said loneliness and social isolation are associated with a reduction in lifespan similar to that of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity. This was before the pandemic. A couple of weeks ago, the New York Times had an article about loneliness and what a real issue it is. And they reported on a study, researchers have begun to find signals in the brain that put the need for social interaction on par with the need to eat. In a study that was published in November, scientists deprived participants of contact with other people and then scanned their brains. After just 10 hours of isolation in the lab where they could read or draw but had no access to phones or computers, people reported feeling lonely and craving social interaction. When they then looked at pictures of people engaged in social activities, scans showed that midbrain activation identical to that of people who looked at pictures of food after 10 hours of fasting. What do we learn from that? Social interaction is not just something that's kind of fun or comforting. It's actually something that we need in order to function. And without social connection, people feel depressed. Chronic loneliness is linked to higher rates of heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, suicide, and even death. What are we going to do during the pandemic, but after the pandemic, to acknowledge the truth of loneliness and how few people actually have, how difficult it is to create communities that respond to that real reality.
And I maybe pick up on that theme and ask this question then. I so appreciate that. I think, one of the challenges is that what's apparent to one generation as we hit a moment is not always apparent or valuable to another generation. And so you spoke about L'dor Vador. I'm thinking about one of the questions that came forth is, how do we build those strong connections outside the generations of our family with other generations? And when you talk about mentors, there are many people on this call who are older than I am, who are my mentors. They're the people that I look at, and I see that they've been able to cultivate relationships with people, younger than them, older than them. How would you suggest that we do that? Not all of us come either with titles or with professional backgrounds that help us access people of other generations. How do we reach to generations beneath us and help them understand that there's a richness for them in having friendships with people across the generational span?
So here we're lucky to be connected to synagogues, because synagogues and faith communities are one of the few institutions that still exist where there is the possibility of multi-generational connections. And so I, throw it back to you. What would it look like to really make this a priority of each of your synagogues? What other kinds of partners in the community? What could you be doing with churches around, getting young people and older people together? What kinds of new mentoring programs are possible. I mean, we were lucky through High Village, we got a small grant from the Natan Foundation to create pilot programs of intergenerational connectedness. One is one we're exploring through the synagogue, and one with the Women's Theater here in Los Angeles. I mean, there are lots of institutions that could benefit from a connection with active older adults who are skilled and energetic and have resources, et cetera, et cetera. How could the synagogue be a mediating institution to make that happen? It's possible. When we, assess these pilot programs that we're doing, I'll send you guys all the information. So, if we started to talk to each other about what we're doing in our synagogues, we probably actually know some of the answers to this. We need to be more bold in this moment. Things are possible now that were never possible before because everybody had to pivot completely, and some things are working, right? I mean, here we are having a Zoom conversation, right? So what are the things that we could be doing now that will enable us to deal with some of this after the pandemic? Which leads right into the fourth issue that I think has been lifted by the pandemic, and that's the importance of technology. Most of us are new to the technology that's been so life-sustaining during this life crisis, right? We can't even know how to share the screen and get into a breakout room where this is hard for us, right? And I don't know about you guys, but when I have a problem and I call my daughter in Boston, she says, "Mom, go to YouTube and figure it out yourself," right? And I try, and it's frustrating. I want her to tell me what to do. I don't want to have to figure it out myself because it's frustrating and sort of exacerbates the isolation and the incompetence that I sometimes feel. How do we use technology to stay connected beyond Zoom? And what's going to happen when we can go back to face-to-face gatherings? There's something great about that, but there's something problematic about it. Some of us don't want to drive at night anymore. And, how do we use technology? Not just Zoom, but WhatsApp, telephone calls. I mean, one of the things about High Village LA is every member of the village is a buddy with somebody else. And so people talk to each other at least once a week. It's an old technology, but it's an important way of staying connected. And we need also to admit that technology is a double-edged sword. There's evidence of a loneliness paradox where tech and social media that should make us more socially connected sometimes increase our feelings of loneliness. All of us know about Zoom fatigue, Zoom life cycle ceremonies. Thank God for them, but at the same time, a shiva where people from Israel or Boston or whatever can participate that couldn't come to a shiva if it were, face to face. You still need a hug. I mean, how do you balance? The utility and the magic of these new technologies with the reality that we need face-to-face contact? These are issues. How are we going to live in a hybrid way in a post-pandemic world is, I think, an important question.
Laura, there are a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to get to. I'm going to give you two of them at once. One is, does the book address losing faith because of death and grieving? And the other one is, does being alone, is that remedied by Zoom meetings?
So I think the Zoom meetings being alone, yes and no. I mean, yes, because here we are talking to each other, but no, because, I would want to go have a cup of coffee with you guys afterwards. I would want to, go and see Nancy's home. I mean, I would want to thank God for this. And at the same time, it's just not enough, right? It's just not enough. So does being able to be on Zoom mitigate loneliness? It does, and it doesn't. And we need to acknowledge that. I think one of the real spiritual challenges of the pandemic, at least for somebody like me, and I would guess I'm projecting onto the rest of you on this call, I feel very lucky I feel very grateful. I am one of the privileged ones. You know, I have a home and I don't worry about where my food is coming from and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I am privileged, but I'm also really sad because this is really hard. And so, how do you acknowledge the truth of both of those things? It's not true that everything is great. And it's also not true that everything's horrible. How do I sit with the truth of both things are true? I think that that's an important challenge for us. And it's something that we need to share with each other. On the other hand, you know, if any of these issues excite any of you, you know, reach out to your rabbis and put together a group. And in a small group, you know, have a listening campaign over Zoom. You could do that. I'm writing, my next book is going to be about ritual, which I hope we get to talk about in the remaining handful of minutes for this stage of life. And I'm very curious to know what people's experience with that is. So I want you to email me and I will pick up the phone and call you or Zoom with you and talk with you about what kinds of things that you are doing in your own life or could imagine doing. So that's the Zoom answer to the question. And what was the first question?
About losing faith because of losing people, especially right now, we're losing more people than ever.
It is, you know, we wrote the book. Richie died before the book was finished. We didn't anticipate that. We started the book, he was completely healthy. He wrote an article about living in the land of the sick, which he began when he was completely healthy. And then he got cancer and it was pretty clear that he was going to die, and he finished the article, you know. And so there is in the book an acknowledgement of mourning. And there were chapters that I wrote after he died about mourning the loss of a loved one. We hadn't intended to put that in the book, but it turns out that it's really an important part of this stage of life. So there's a lot of things that I know now that I would have made a higher priority. And I think, but yes, there are, that exists. We didn't talk about mourning rituals because there are lots of wonderful books about Jewish mourning rituals, but there is material in the book about grieving. And again, the book is a toolkit, so there are tools. At the end of each chapter, there are resources that you can go to for to find more information about things that you're interested in.
Laura, I was thinking as well, because I think that's such a powerful question. How do we not lose faith as we go through so much that's difficult? That that your book does help us with that. I think the pieces about Jewish wisdom, you know, if that faith is something you work on constantly through your life, through every stage and every age, and that if we're able to cultivate our faith and our Jewish learning, you know, at every stage and through these times, then our faith will be, you know, more present with us at those moments when we're challenged. Then it becomes something we're able to utilize rather than worry about where it has gone. So it is part of that preparation of, you know, getting better, you know, getting better within ourselves.
And I do think it's important also to say that sometimes, you know, I feel like God's face is hidden from me. I mean, you know, that it's also true in the course of a thoughtful person's life. Right. There are moments when you feel more connected to your faith community. There are times when you feel less connected, and to kind of honor that and to really listen to your own experience and share what you're feeling. I mean, the most important thing, among the important things that came out of the book, is what I'm experiencing, you guys are experiencing too. So that, I mean, we know from the Women's Rabbinic Network, for example, that women colleagues who are all friends now are reaching out to each other to say, God, this is really hard for me. How are you dealing with this? And, you know, I'm experiencing a crisis of faith now. What do I do? I mean, to be able to admit this and to talk to people is really important, and to recognize that, as we learn in Ecclesiastes, you know, there is a time for every purpose under heaven, and no stage lasts forever, and how you move through them with grace. You titled this Aging Gracefully, the grace of aging. Part of the grace of aging is listening to your own experience and sharing it with other people.
I loved that you wrote a chapter about ritual, and I know that that's incredibly important to you. And you said you were hoping to get a chance to talk about this. I'll just share with you that in my, in my own journey, when my grandma Essie, who was just, beloved, when she turned 90 in 1990, I think that may have been one of the first rituals I created, which was a family ritual celebrating her turning 90. And we wrapped it around a Havdalah ceremony, and we used that as the basis for it. And, that was an amazing family experience with all of her grandchildren and children there with us. So creating rituals for aging has been an interest of mine. And when we stop and think as women, how few experiences out of women's lives actually have had traditional rituals, I know that creating rituals has been just a wonderful personal interest for you throughout your rabbinate. Maybe you can talk a little bit about where you see moments of ritual for perennials.
So, really, we only have 2 minutes, so I'm going to just say this really fast, and that is lots of life cycle rituals for the first third of our life, right? But after marriage, and for some of us divorce, the next traditional life cycle ritual is funeral.
Right.
And the irony is that most of us, God willing, are going to live a lot more years between our first marriages and our funerals than between when we were born and when we were first married. So what about that stage of life? What are the moments? Jewish tradition is very clear that divinity, however we understand it, is present at any moment in our life. We just have to stop and notice it. Life cycle rituals is stopping and noticing that divinity is present, that there's something more powerful than just my own experience. And how do I mark that? What are the moments? A big birthday. What are the moments? Sending a kid off to college or whatever. What are the moments? Retirement. There are lots of different potential moments. And the thing about ritual that's really important is it's not only just about ourselves, but it's about how we are encouraged to think about something. So I think, for example, recovery from illness, somebody writes, absolutely. In LA, I'm sure this is true where you guys live as well. When somebody has to stop driving, it's a huge loss. One of the major conflicts between people of our generation or a little bit older, when it's not safe to drive anymore. And, how does that happen? And people experience giving up their keys as totally about loss and shame. What would happen if we could imagine, if your synagogues could imagine, honoring people who in a given year were wise enough to know that it was time to stop driving and given a status of elder, whatever it is. It's not just about loss, it's also about wisdom. How do we celebrate that? So marking these moments and suggesting through the way we mark them that this is not about loss. When your grandmother turned 90, it wasn't about loss. She was towards the end of her life, but still, all life cycle rituals have both loss and something. How do we pay attention, lift up, the positive? And by the way, if your synagogues were to do something like this, then it's on you to figure out how to get that person to shul, right? So that it's not just my problem anymore that I don't drive, but my community has acknowledged my wisdom in giving up my keys. And now how are we as a community going to make sure that people still have access to the things they need to have access to? That is the power of ritual. I'm not going to read this, I was going to, but those of you that have the book, take a look at the story on page 27 of a family that, as they were downsizing from a home to a condominium, created this ritual of going from room to room, thanking the room for the wonderful memories. Not even a Jewish ritual, didn't involve a rabbi, didn't involve a synagogue. We don't need our rabbis and synagogues. for everything, although for some things it might be enriched if we do, but to imagine what you could be creating on your own with the people that are most important to you. So listen, there's so much more to talk about. Here's what I hope will happen, that any of you that have been interested by any of the things that I'm saying, send me an email and I will respond and, encourage your wonderful rabbis to continue this conversation in whatever ways might be meaningful to you.
Laura, I want to thank you so much. And in encouraging people to send you an email, I'm going to encourage them first to buy your book, because they may find answers to their questions in here, and they may find so many more questions to then reach out to you or to me or to Suzanne about. I think, as always, because you have always been that voice of conscience in the Jewish community, you're not just asking us to think about what it means to be in this time of life, but you're also forcing that conversation on other generations to think about how we make our perennial community visible and how we respond to the experiences of their life. And again, as you said, this is paving the way for this to become de rigueur for each next generation as they come along. So when our children and grandchildren move through the stages of life, that they will find the kind of support that maybe doesn't exist at this moment, but needs to exist. So
with that, let me just make one final comment, which is to say the bottom line of the book and of this whole conversation is 70 is not the new 50. 70 is the new 70. How we do it really matters, because we're changing the world for ourselves and for those who come after us.
Perfect. Laura, thank you for your time this morning. Before we end, I just want to let the people who are here joining us know that we invited Laura to be part of the first of 3 speakers in this topic about aging gracefully. So we hope you'll join us next month, March 7th. Rabbi Doug Cohn, also a dear friend, who has written some very powerful books on surviving cancer, moving through cancer. His latest book, On Broken Fragments, is about dealing with dementia in our family life and in our communities as well. So I hope you will join Doug. He's just a passionate and a kind and a thoughtful thinker. So that will be on March 7th. And our final program, I think it's April 11th is the date, right? Suzanne, is Rabbi Richie Address, who for decades has sort of been the voice. He began in this, well, he didn't begin his rabbinate, but he was the face from the URJ of the Department on Family Concerns. And so he's really been sort of the one who has spoken about this age, this stage, and he will be extraordinary as well for us. So keep looking in materials that we send out from Temple Beth Torah, that Beth El sends out for links for those events. And again, thank you for being with us. It's been, Suzanne, this was a pleasure to get to do this with our congregations together.
It was really nice to be together. And thank you, Laura, for a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.
And, yeah.
So have a wonderful Sunday, everybody. And there's probably more to life than the Super Bowl today. Go find it.
Bye-bye.
Knows that Rabbi
Thank you so much. Thank you.